The click of the front door is burned into my head like a song I can't stop humming. It was the kind of click that meant finality, not a pause, not a warning. One moment she was in the kitchen, laughing at something I'd said about the TV show we both pretended to love. The next moment the house felt hollow, like someone had unplugged the warmth. I stood there with a coffee mug cooling in my hand and the sudden, stupid thought that I could fix whatever had broken. I couldn't even hear the car pull away because my ears were full of questions. We weren't perfect. Nobody is. But we had plans, tiny, stubborn plans that lived in receipts, in sticky notes on the fridge, in the way she'd steal my hoodie on cold nights. Then the first problem hit, the layoff. I was the one who came home with fewer answers than I did bills, the one whose resume suddenly mattered less than the illusion of stability. I started going through motions, networking, interviews, late-night forms. She took on more shifts, started closing the curtains earlier, and laughed less at the stupid jokes I'd always made. That night I opened her drawer to find a stack of unopened mail and a receipt that wasn't ours. I pressed my thumb to the smudge of lipstick on the envelope like some idiot detective, hoping logic would reveal itself. Instead I found a name I didn't recognize and a time-stamped message that made my chest drop to my knees. I've got to say this now, just like I say everything in this voice, subscribe and tell me in the comments what you would do if you were in my shoes. Was I overreacting? Or had I just found the first real clue that my life was about to unravel? Then my phone buzzed with a picture message from an unknown number, and that picture was of her, smiling in a place I'd never seen her go. I opened it and saw something I wasn't ready for. Small things are where big lies hide. It started with minutes, not hours. She was home in 5 and arrived an hour later, or she brushed past me without touching my hand, her laugh a beat late. At first I blamed stress, blamed my job situation, blamed anything but the real possibility that she was slipping away. We had a tiny apartment with 2 mugs and a chipped plate and an old calendar where we circled big dates. I watched that calendar fill up with questions. I tried to be practical. We tightened our budget. I applied for roles I'd never considered. I bragged to friends about interviews that felt more like auditioning for patients. She said she was proud. Later I found the receipts, a coffee shop across town we never went to, a florist in a neighborhood she liked to pretend she only passed by. Little things stacking like bricks until they made a wall I could no longer see around. I started checking her phone when she left it face down on the counter because the silence of our kitchen made me nervous. I told myself I would only look for patterns, times, numbers, names. That's how it begins, a rationalization dressed up as protection. Was I wrong for what I did? I asked myself that quietly while scanning conversation threads and saved photos. Everything I found was the kind of normal that can hide a betrayal. Messages stamped at 2 in the morning, a nickname I'd never heard, photos of her in places she used to mark girls' nights that turned out to be dates. When I confronted her with one simple question, she smiled in a way that didn't meet my eyes and said, "You're imagining things." Her hands trembled just enough for me to see the truth and not have permission to touch it. Later that week, a co-worker called me at work and said she'd seen my wife with someone else, at a bar downtown. There's a particular cruelty in a message that arrives on a Monday. You already feel small under fluorescent lights, your weekend self tucked away like laundry. Mine arrived while I sat through a presentation about growth metrics I could no longer deliver. My phone lit with a single line, "Did you really think she'd stick around?" No sender. No punctuation. A screenshot attached that flattened my lungs. I stared at that screenshot until the text crawled into focus, a conversation between my wife and another man. Dates. Plans. A photo of her laughing on a couch that wasn't ours. The man's name was simple, like a knife that only needed to be picked up to cut. I felt fury and disbelief in equal measures, but also a strange, animal sorrow that made my eyes hot. I left the meeting early, hands sweaty, and drove home like I was moving through someone else's story. At home she was making dinner, humming a song I used to know. I tried to keep my voice steady. We talked circles at first, weather, errands, a neighbor's cat. When I pushed, she went quiet and then said something that still stings, "You're always so dramatic." I watched as words formed in my head that I would not say. "I lost my job, I'm scared, I need you." The screenshot felt heavier than any confession. That night I found a second phone tucked in a jacket she rarely wore. It wasn't elaborate, just a burner with a few messages, schedules, and a nickname she'd never used in front of me. I thought about leaving quietly, about packing my things and becoming the hero of my own escape. Instead I sat on the couch and waited for her to come to me. She knocked, opened the door, and the man in the screenshot walked in behind her, smiling like he owned the light in our hallway. You'd think seeing someone walk into your home with a woman you love would be cinematic, but it was banal in the worst way. He hugged her, casual and familiar, and for a second I wondered if I was invisible. The man looked like any guy, an easy grin, a jacket with a scuff, but when he offered me his hand I realized I'd need both hands to catch myself. I introduced myself because we're taught to be polite, even when the ground is shifting beneath us. They apologized as if this were awkward for them, not explosive for me. She called him by a name I'd only read in texts, and my voice felt far away when I asked how long this had been going on. She said a few months, and that word felt like the first brick dropping off a cliff. The man said something about timing and needing to talk. I laughed, because laughing felt safer than yelling. I sat at the kitchen table while they spoke like strangers about plans and feelings and consequences, and I felt smaller with every syllable. I asked for the truth and got half answers, not out of cleverness but out of cowardice. She said she'd been trying to protect me from worrying about money, from seeing her make choices she feared I'd judge. That line, "I didn't want to worry you," made my anger knot in my throat burn. If she'd wanted to protect me, why hide the late-night receipts? While I about where she was going, I kept thinking of our old calendar, of the sticky notes, of the mugs. When they left, they kissed like a secret shared between co-conspirators. I made my own moves then, small, stupid moves that felt like control. I opened a joint account online and froze it. Then I sat on the floor and cried, loud and weird, while the apartment watched me. The next morning there was a message on the frozen account from someone I hadn't expected, and it threatened everything I thought I owned. Money is boring until it's not. We had always split things quietly, like mutual respect disguised as habit. After the burner phone and the open door night, I started reading bank statements with the intensity of someone learning a foreign language. The patterns were obvious if you were looking: transfers to an account I didn't know, charges for flights I had not taken, and an unfamiliar address that kept recurring. It felt like peeling off wallpaper to find a different room behind it. She said she was trying to keep us afloat. The truth was messier. The man she'd been seeing had offered help, cash for a deposit on an opportunity, a loan to get through the month, a promise that sounded like safety. I found emails where she'd accepted money and promised returns, dates stamped in ways that made me dizzy. When I confronted her about the bank transfers she cried and said she didn't know what else to do. I asked who had the other account and she gave me a name that matched the burner phone and the late-night photos. There's a violence to watching someone you love erase you from the ledger of their life. I felt betrayed, yes, but I also felt foolish. Why hadn't I seen the signs? Why had I let secrecy wedge itself between us like a third person? I called friends, a few who had stuck around since the layoff, and their voices were kind but raw. They admitted they'd noticed my silence and her new hours, but they'd expected reconciliation, not disclosure. In the middle of that night I made a decision that still sits weird with me. I forwarded some of the messages to her sister. I told myself she needed family who knew everything. Was I wrong? Did I overstep? The next morning her sister called me in a voice that made it clear this was bigger than we were ready for. When I went to the place where the transfers had been sent, I found a small rental with a mailbox full of pictures of her with another family I never imagined. The rental was disguised with potted plants and a mailbox that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke. When I knelt to look through the small window I saw a living room setup that looked like ours, a couch, a framed photograph, except in that frame my wife was smiling with two little kids I'd never seen. I pressed my forehead to the glass and felt like I was trespassing through the worst kind of fiction. At first I thought the photo was recent, then I saw the dates, the pattern, a life built in the edges of our life. There were toys in a closet, a school backpack with a name I didn't know, receipts from pediatricians, and a holiday card addressed to Anna and family. My stomach turned. She had a second world, a second name maybe, or at least a second identity. When I found out the kids weren't hers biologically, they were from a relationship he'd kept hidden, the man's previous life, it added a new layer of betrayal. She had been woven into someone else's history as a secret partner. Confronting her about it turned into a long, messy night of confessions and excuses. She said she'd fallen in love with a life that made her feel capable and needed when I was grieving the job I lost. She said the other man's past had space that made her feel seen. I tried to be angry only at the affair and not at the children in the photos, but my feelings would not be parceled out so politely. Who do you think is the real villain here? I asked my friends later, when they were too polite to say what they thought. They were torn, some blamed her, others blamed me for being absent. I wondered if my choice to stay silent, to take nights to send out resumes instead of asking for help, had left room for her to look elsewhere. The next week, A package arrived for me, a custody letter for a dog we never owned, and a note that said she was leaving at dawn. The morning she left was a storm of small gestures that added up to a hurricane. She packed a bag with the kind of efficiency you learn when practice has made you ruthless. She left a note, not hateful, not loving, just factual: "I can't do this anymore." No explanation, but a folded list of instructions about utilities and a name and number I didn't recognize. There was calm in her handwriting that made my chest hurt. She left with a man from the burner phone, and she took more than the clothes in her bag. She took the certainty we had constructed out of shared bills and grocery lists. Our friends came by, awkward and quiet, as if there might be an etiquette for grief. I remember sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal at noon with the TV on low, the sound like a distant conversation in another house. It felt unreal until I walked into our bedroom and found the jacket with the spare phone gone, the perfume she loved wiped from the collar where I used to bury my face. I called her. I left voicemails that shifted from pleading to accusing and then to silence. Her number went unanswered until evening, when a text came through: "I'm sorry." I needed to breathe. No details, no promises. I asked the internet for advice and got 100 versions of the same things: document everything, talk to a lawyer, see a therapist. Legalities were dry but necessary, and the weight of them made me feel like an adult who'd been reading a manual for a machine he no longer understood. There's a particular loneliness in watching someone you thought you knew start a new life without you. I posted a status about needing space, and the replies were immediate: friends checking in, strangers with similar stories, a meme that made me laugh and then sob. That night, I got an email from her with attached photos and 3 words that changed the angle of everything: "I'm pregnant, Dan." The moment I read the email I felt like the air had been replaced with water. Pregnant. The word folded around me like a story I hadn't gotten to the middle of. She had known for weeks, apparently, and had been carrying the decision like contraband. The other man, the one with the jacket, the burner phone, had a reaction I could only read between lines: joy, fear, confusion. She'd chosen him, or at least chosen to stay with him long enough to carry a child. My mind kept returning to the nights I'd been invisible, to the phone calls I'd let go to voicemail while working freelance gigs, to the times I'd said, "We'll handle it," and meant later. The pregnancy amplified guilt and betrayal in equal parts. I wanted to be angry at her for the affair and at myself for being absent. I wanted to be angry at the man who'd entered our life and made promises. But anger is a busy thing, it doesn't leave room for grief, and I had a lot of grief to carry. She sent me pictures of the ultrasound. It felt obscene to look at them and not be changed by the sight of a tiny heartbeat. My instinct was to offer support, to be a decent human, but there was a rawness between us like an open wound. I tried calling to ask how she was, but the phone buzzed on my end with "do not contact" from a new number. I typed messages and deleted them. My friends told me to step back, to focus on myself, to get a lawyer. My mother told me to be kinder to myself. That night I packed a bag and left the apartment for a hotel so I could think without seeing her toothbrush in the sink. In the morning there was a voicemail from her mother that said, "She wants nothing to do with you, but she keeps asking about your mother." Sometimes betrayal is private, sometimes it becomes public, especially when people have opinions and social media. A week after I moved into the hotel, a mutual friend invited me to a casual dinner to clear the air. I went because I needed normal human contact. The dinner became a slow reveal. Someone across the table casually mentioned that my wife had announced the pregnancy to co-workers with a framed ultrasound pinned up by the office break room, and everyone clapped like it was a promotion. I felt sick. The world seemed to be continuing on my axis while my personal universe flipped. I tried to respond with a joke about the timing, but the words stuck. The next day I found screenshots on a gossip thread, people I had known nodding at a story I hadn't been allowed to tell. Her version of events painted me as the struggling partner who couldn't provide, and that neat little narrative spread fast. Friends I'd expected to take my side offered platitudes instead of solidarity, worried about being sucked into the drama. I worked on rebuilding a reputation while also trying to get my life in order. I went to networking events and felt highs like judgment. People treated me differently, some with pity, some with curiosity. I posted something small and honest on social media, not a confession, just a simple admission that I was hurt and seeking growth. The responses were varied, a flood of private messages, a few ugly comments, and an unexpected note from a woman I'd known since college saying, "I'm so sorry. Do you want to talk?" I took her call and found myself telling a stranger more truth than I'd shared with anyone. It helped me see that my story still belonged to me, even if others wanted to claim pieces. 2 days later, at a gathering, my wife walked in with the man and held up the ultrasound like a banner. The room cheered, and the look on her face was not something I recognized. The cruelest thing about betrayal is not the act itself but how people react when forced to pick. Invitations stopped coming. Some friends asked if I was over it, as though pain had an expiration date. Others were protective, offering couch space and pizza, making me feel temporarily less invisible. I learned who would sit with me in the silence and who would, without malice, drift away. There was a friend, Mark, who refused to take a side publicly. He called it moral neutrality. I called it cowardice. One night we had it out in a bar with the lights low and the beer loud. Mark told me he'd seen my wife laughing with the other man at a sushi place and didn't want to be involved in gossip. I told him how it felt to be left and erased. He shut down. That night I realized friendships were not always about right and wrong, sometimes they were about convenience. Then there was Lila, who showed up one afternoon with a box of my things from the old apartment. She cried when she handed me the worn-out mug with a crack down the side and said, "You deserve better." Her kindness was a lifeline. She pushed me to apply to jobs I'd thought were out of reach and dragged me to therapy appointments. She asked real questions. What do you want your life to look like in a year? It felt strange to think in those terms when the present was such a mess. I started to understand that healing needed scaffolding, legal advice, counseling, friends who would be present without judgment. As I tried to rebuild, an email from my wife landed in my inbox with a single line, "We need to talk about your involvement in the group chat." It happened because someone thought secrets were gossip and gossip was currency. A mutual friend had added me back into a closed group chat where people I'd once trusted coordinated dinners and birthdays. I opened it hoping for normalcy but found screenshots of messages I'd never seen, my wife's comments about me, mocking little things about my job hunt, and worse, a private joke about leaving without telling me. The betrayal multiplied because it wasn't just between us anymore, it was a shared story. I confronted the friend who shared the chat. They said they didn't think it mattered, that everyone was venting. That casual dismissal made me angrier than anything. I sent messages to the group that were more raw than I intended. I typed things like, "You all know who she is and do any of you remember when we used to care?" Some people apologized. Others doubled down, saying I was causing drama. Was I wrong for responding publicly? Many people thought so. Some told me to stay private, to be the bigger person. Others said my response was the only honest thing anyone in the chat had seen in months. The blowback from that night was immediate, a few invitations vanished, comments turned cold, and the scapegoating started. But there was also a surprising result, a private message from someone in the group who admitted they'd always felt awkward and offered to help me find a spot at their firm. That anonymous offer led to a meeting that would change everything, but it started with a message from someone who knew more than they were saying. I took the meeting. It was weirdly clinical at first, a conference room with polished wood and cookies on a plate. The person who'd messaged me was a junior manager who said she'd been impressed with my LinkedIn and wanted to offer a short contract. It was small, 3 months, part-time, but it was a foothold. I signed, handshaking, and felt something like relief in the business of being useful. Work gave me structure. It made me feel human again, not just a man in a hotel eating takeout alone. I learned to answer emails with confidence and to sit in meetings without pretending. I started going to therapy twice a week and learned to name feelings I'd been swallowing: betrayal, shame, fear. Naming them made them less like monsters under the bed and more like things I could address. I also started small rituals, a run at dawn, writing a list of things I could control, reconnecting with family. My mother sent care packages with terrible knitted scarves and notes that smelled like her perfume. It was almost ridiculous, the way ordinary things could stitch me back together. I put together a budget, opened a new bank account, and met with a lawyer just to understand my rights and obligations. The lawyer gave practical advice: keep documentation, don't burn bridges you might need to cross later. There were stumbles. I sent a message to her by accident, emotional residue from a night of weakness, and felt stupid for weeks. But the contract led to something permanent, an opportunity to be hired full-time after proving myself. My boss told me straight, "We need someone who can handle chaos and deliver. You did that." That sentence hit me like a prize. With a steady job and some savings, I finally had the courage to file for legal protection of assets, and that triggered a final, unexpected message from her. Legal paperwork is both mundane and brutal. I sat in a lawyer's office with pens that felt important and forms that felt like verdicts. The process wasn't cinematic, no dramatic courtroom speeches or decisive rulings, just signatures, mediations, and the careful arithmetic of dividing a life. She had already moved on, and agreement seemed more efficient than argument for both of us. I wanted to scream, I wanted to demand restitution. Instead I learned to choose my battles. The mediator was a woman with soft eyes who kept bringing us back to practicalities, leases, shared debts, and who would keep what. I wanted to keep everything that reminded me of us, a chipped mug, a worn calendar, a poster from the concert we loved. The mediator said sentiment isn't currency. We negotiated with lists and spreadsheets until the sentimental things became minor concessions. I gave up the mug in exchange for keeping the old couch. It felt absurd until I sat on that couch the first night after the paper was signed. Even in settlement there were surprises. I discovered she'd left me a letter I didn't find until months later stuffed in a book I'd thought she'd never read. It was long, half apology and half ode to the life she'd chosen. She wrote about fear and the comfort she found elsewhere, about feeling like she couldn't be honest while I was shrinking into myself. The letter hurt, but it also explained. Not justification, but explanation. I read it twice and then filed it away. When I finally felt a fragile sense of closure, a message appeared from her with a newborn photo attached and a line that cut me open. "He looks like you." Seeing that photo felt like a test I hadn't agreed to. I stared at the newborn's tiny fingers in the shadows of a face that might resemble mine. My first reaction was irrational anger, then sorrow, then an odd swell of tenderness. I had a choice, rage or acceptance. I chose to be a man who respected boundaries. That choice saved me from doing things I'd have regretted. I focused on small victories, steady paychecks, a gym membership I used, a friend's apartment that no longer smelled of our life. I started volunteering on weekends at a community center where people taught me resilience in ways I hadn't known I needed. Listening to others' stories made mine feel less like a singular catastrophe and more like part of a messy human tapestry. I also started dating, awkwardly and with an honesty I learned from the ashes. First dates are weird when your emotional furniture is mid-renovation. I told people I was rebuilding, some walked away, some stayed. Those who stayed were patient in a way that felt like a salve. I found someone who liked old movies and laughed at my jokes even when they weren't funny. Not every day is good, but the pattern of days is getting better. I still had bad nights, sudden images, songs, places that pulled me backward. Therapy helped me train my mind to not live in those nights. I learned to ask, what can I control? And do that thing. I learned to set boundaries on social media and to mute conversations that netted me more pain than growth. One evening, a text arrived from an unknown number. "Can we meet? I want to apologize in person." It was from I almost didn't go, but curiosity and the need for a real ending pulled me to a small cafe on a rainy afternoon. She looked the same and different, older in a way that had nothing to do with years and everything to do with choices. She apologized slowly, like unwrapping something fragile. She spoke about mistakes and fear in the way she had run toward a life that seemed easier when I seemed hard to reach. Her voice cracked when she talked about the baby and about the guilt that kept her up at night. I listened without interrupting. It was a strange privilege to be allowed to witness someone else's regret. I asked questions, not to hurt but to understand. There were answers that explained nothing and explanations that felt empty. She wanted me to know the truth, that she had been scared, selfish, and human. I told her I had forgiven her in the practical sense. I had settled our affairs, moved cities, rebuilt a life, but forgiveness and trust are different currencies. Some things heal, others become lessons. As we left the cafe I felt lighter than I had in years. Not unscarred, not unbruised, but solid. I had a stable job, friends who stayed, and nights that didn't require explanations. I'd learned how to stand for myself without making someone else my enemy. I learned that surviving betrayal doesn't mean you forget, it means you build a future that isn't defined by that moment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and stay tuned for the next drama. Was I wrong for checking her phone? Who do you think is the real villain here, her, him, or the slow collapse of my silence? Subscribe and tell me in the comments what you would do if you were in my shoes.